The further I climbed, the less the world looked like a place people lived. No power lines. No mailboxes. Just trees pressing in, their trunks like watchful sentinels. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, and it echoed through the valley like a warning. When I first saw the house again, my heart lifted. Even in its ruined state, it had always struck me as a place with bones worth saving. Its stone chimney, pitched roof, and sprawling porch had once been grand. Now it stood silent, the gray siding streaked with rainwater stains, vines curling up the eaves as though the forest was trying to claim it. Still, I smiled. This was mine now, my project, my chance at shaping something forgotten into something beautiful again. I parked by the crooked fence line and grabbed the toolbox from the passenger seat. The boards of the porch groaned beneath me, just as they had last time, when I'd come up here to lock the place and plan the first stage of renovations. I already knew what I wanted: new flooring, a sanded banister, maybe a fire pit in the yard. I set my toolbox down and reached for the key I kept in my pocket, cold brass between my fingers. That was when I noticed the doorknob. The lock I'd paid extra to have installed was gone. Not broken, not tampered one. A different knob, an older brass one, sat in its place, tarnished as though it had always been there. My chest tightened. I twisted it, half expecting resistance. Instead, the door swung inward with unsettling ease. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the damp rot and dust I come to expect from this house. It was warm. Wood smoke. Stew, maybe beans. The kind of smell that belonged to a place lived in. My boots scuffed the threshold, and when I looked down, I realized I wasn't standing on bare work planks anymore. A rug stretched across the entryway. Thick, patterned, and utterly out of place. I froze. Someone had been here. I stepped forward slowly, every creak of the floor like a gunshot in the silence. My eyes darted across the room, trying to remember the way it had looked before. The cracked plaster, the cobweb corners, the sagging furniture I'd meant to toss out. Now it was different. There was a lantern glowing on the mantel, blankets draped over chairs. A table stood near the far wall, and on it, folded neat and tidy, was a stack of clothes that definitely wasn't mine. And then I saw him. A man sat in one of the living room chairs, the one I had dragged away from the wall during my first inspection. He wore a flannel coat, thick and patched at the elbows, and in his hands he cradled a chipped mug, steam rising from it. His face was rough, weathered by years outdoors, with a beard that looked like it had grown unchecked for months. He looked up at me. For a heartbeat, we just stared at one another, two strangers locked in a silence so taut I could hear my own pulse. His eyes were steady, unreadable. Beside him, a young woman moved. She had been bent over the table, folding clothes with deliberate care, her hair falling in a curtain around her face. When she realized I was there, she stiffened, her hands freezing mid-fold. Her gaze darted to the man, then to me, wide with something I couldn't place. Fear or maybe defiance. I opened my mouth, but the words came out ragged. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. He set his mug down on the table, the clink of ceramic against wood echoing in the room like a gavel strike. Then he leaned back in the chair, one hand resting on the arm, the other hanging loosely at his side. His voice, when it came, was low but steady, as though he had already decided what he was going to say long before I appeared. "This is our home," with the words to register at first. My brain scrambled for logic, for sense, but nothing fit. My jaw tightened. No, it isn't. This house is mine. I pulled the folded deed from my jacket pocket, waving it like proof against insanity. I signed for it. I have the paperwork right here. You can't just... He tilted his head slightly, as though he pitied me. "Paper doesn't mean anything up here." The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but edged with urgency. "Please," she said, and I could hear the plea in it, though I couldn't tell if it was directed at me or at him. "Don't." Something about her tone unsettled me more than his calm defiance. It was as though I had stepped into a conversation they'd been having long before I arrived, one that I couldn't possibly understand. I tightened my grip on the deed. "Look, I don't know what you're doing here, but you can't stay. This house hasn't belonged to anyone fair and square. You need to pack your things and go before I call the sheriff." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened, like steel catching the light. "The sheriff doesn't come up here," he said. The silence that followed pressed in on me, heavy as the fog outside. The lantern flickered. Somewhere in the rafters, a board creaked. My throat felt dry. I realized in that moment that I wasn't holding a toolbox or a deed or even ownership of this place. I was holding nothing, because inside these walls paper meant nothing. Locks meant nothing. Down the mountain, the world I knew might still exist, with its rules and officials and consequences. But up here in the cold, forgotten bones of this house, I was a trespasser. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You should leave," he said simply. The woman's eyes met mine, full of something I couldn't place. Regret, maybe warning. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Before it gets dark." I backed away a step, then another, until my shoulder brushed the frame of the door. My hand fumbled for the knob. I wanted to shout, to rage, to tell them they had no right. But something in the way they watched me, calm and unshaken, made the words shrivel in my throat. I stepped back into the fading light of the porch, the fog already swallowing the yard. And for the first time since I bought the house, I wondered if I had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. ChatGPT said I couldn't bring myself to drive back down the mountain that night. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel after what I had seen inside, the way they had looked at me like I was the intruder. My own house, bought with my own money, suddenly felt alien. I parked the truck by the fence line and killed the engine. The silence that followed was suffocating. The forest around me seemed to lean in closer, whispering in the whine that I didn't belong here. I told myself I would stay just long enough to get my head straight, maybe until morning, then figure out what to do. My phone barely had a bar of service. The sheriff's office was over an hour away, and if what the man had said was true, that the sheriff never came up here, I doubted they'd hurry even if I called. Still, I clutched my phone like a lifeline, staring out the window of the cab at the silhouette of the house. It looked harmless enough from the outside. The chimney, the sagging roofline, the porch railings gnawed by rot. If I hadn't stepped inside, I might have believed it was still abandoned. But I couldn't forget the smell of food, the folded clothes, the flicker of a lantern. The image of the man's steady eyes haunted me every time I closed mine. Night came quickly in the mountains. One moment there was a pale wash of gray light, and the next it was swallowed by black, broken only by the faint glow of stars filtered through fog. I lay across the seat of my truck, wrapped in a blanket, listening to every sound. Branches cracking, the distant rush of a stream, something moving in the underbrush too close for comfort. Sleep was impossible. That was when I saw it. A light flickered in the house. At first, I thought it was the lantern again, maybe the man and woman settling in for the night. But no, the glow wasn't steady. It pulsed, shifting from one window to another, finally pausing at the second story. My stomach tightened. The upstairs had been empty when I left, broken glass, peeling wallpaper. But now, a steady flame wavered against the darkness, unmistakable through the cracked pane. My curiosity outpaced my fear. I told myself I needed proof, something I could show the sheriff if it came to that. Maybe pictures, maybe just enough detail to make sense of this nightmare. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. Instead, I slipped from the truck and crept across the yard, boots pressing into the damp earth. Every board of like it was trying to betray me. The closer I got, the clearer the light became. It wasn't a lantern. It was candles. Several of them. Their glow leaked through the upstairs window in shifting patterns, as though the flames are being disturbed. I crouched below the sill and lifted myself just enough to peer inside. My breath caught. 3 figures sat in a circle on the floor. The man in the flannel, the young woman who had folded the laundry, and someone else. Older, with hair hanging in silver strands down their back. The 3 of them knelt around a ring of candles, their faces lit by orange glow, their shadows towering against the peeling wallpaper. Their hands were clasped, their heads bowed. They were speaking. Low, steady words that blended together in a rhythm, almost like chanting. The sound barely reached me through the glass, but every syllable felt deliberate, carved into the silence. I strained to make sense of it. Most of it was a blur, but one word repeated again, threading through their voices with eerie finality. Stay. My chest tightened. Stay. As if the word itself had weight. As if it wasn't just something they were saying, but something they were trying to impose on the house, the mountain, maybe even me. Then, as though sensing me, the older figure lifted their head. Our eyes met through the broken pane. Their gaze was sharp and unyielding, the candlelight turning their pupils into black pits. They didn't startle. They didn't call out. They just looked at me, like they had expected me to be there all along. I stumbled back, my boot catching on a loose plank. The sound cracked through the night. Inside, the chanting stopped. Silence fell, heavier than before. I scrambled away from the window, my breath ragged, and nearly tripped over the porch steps as I fled into the yard. The fog closed in around me, thick and damp, muffling everything. I reached the truck, my hands fumbling for the door handle, and slid inside. My chest rose and felt like I'd run a marathon. My eyes stayed locked on the house, waiting for movement at the windows, a figure on the porch, something to confirm what I had seen. But the house stayed still, its windows dark once more, as though nothing had happened at all. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, trying to steady myself. My rational mind clawed for explanations. Squatters, maybe some mountain cult, people desperate enough to turn an abandoned house into their refuge. But no explanation dulled the memory of that word, whispered in unison, woven through the candlelight. Stay. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, maybe hours. The night stretched on endlessly, the fog never lifting. I thought about driving away. But every time my hand touched the ignition, something held me back. What if they came outside? What if followed? And what if, deep down, the word wasn't meant for them at all? What if it was meant for me? Because the longer I sat in the cab, the heavier my body felt, as though the mountain itself pressed down on me. My eyelids grew heavy despite the adrenaline, and the thought crept into my head, uninvited but insistent maybe I should stay. I shook it off violently, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. No, I couldn't. The house wasn't mine anymore. Not really, I had bought it on paper, but something else had claimed it long before me. Those strangers weren't just living there. They were part of it, tied to it in a way I didn't understand. And I had stumbled into their circle like a fool who thought ownership meant anything on this mountain. The candles burned in my memory long after their light vanished from the windows. And as I sat there in the cab of my truck, surrounded by fog and silence, I realized the most terrifying part wasn't that they were inside my house. It was that, somehow, I wasn't sure I could leave.